Welcome back to my listeners. I am Harriet Hendel, and this is Pursuing Justice on Society Bites Radio, part of the Radio Ear Network family. During this very unsettling time, listening to podcasts is a way to shrink the distance between us all. As we broadcast today, I encourage each of you to follow the guidelines by adhering to social distancing and washing your hands as much as you can. We've been talking a great deal on this podcast about innocent people behind bars. As we watch the coronavirus creep into every corner of our lives, I think of so many people I am in touch with who are incarcerated, and so many I don't know who are in harm's way. I hope with all my heart that the prisons do their best to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. Our guest today is a friend of mine. Her name is Janet HEIJENS. She spent much of her life in business, and in 2014, she began writing a series of mystery novels. The first book was called Wrongful Conviction, and the second one was called Snook Wallow, and the third was Casperson Beach. And now she's working on book 4. Janet took a class that I taught several years ago, which was called Locked Up, Justice Denied. And that's how we met. Janet, it's wonderful to have you as my guest today.
Well, thank you, Harriet. I'm honored to be part of the podcast.
Well, that's great. Before we talk about your books, can you tell us more about your interest in the criminal justice system and specifically why wrongful conviction?
Certainly. At the time that I started writing Wrongful Conviction, my son was in school, law school up in New York, and had just secured an internship with the Manhattan prosecutor's office. So we used to talk about his experiences fairly often, and he was really drawn to the criminal justice side of law. So that was going on in the background. That heightened my awareness of all things criminal justice that I was hearing and seeing around me. And my eye was drawn to an article in our local Sarasota paper. They were running a series of articles about a gentleman whose name is James Joseph Richardson, who had just been exonerated after spending 21 years in prison for the murder of his 7 children.
Oh.
It was a heartbreaking story, and it just gripped me. The topic then piqued my interest, and I started to research a little bit more about wrongful convictions, the frequency of them, and the cause of how somebody could lose 21 years of his life after the tragedy of having lost his whole family, really. And so the idea was born that perhaps I could fictionalize the story of this gentleman and bring it to market as a writing exercise, really. Interestingly, I was picked when the book was finished. I was picked up immediately by a publisher, so that led to where I am today. Really, the series was born. Now, if I could just, Harriet, I think it's really important to highlight this terrible tragedy of Mr. Richardson. He was convicted back in '68. The 7 children had been murdered by having their lunch poisoned.
Oh.
And he was a mentally challenged individual. He worked as a farm laborer. And this happened when he and his wife were both working in the fields. They came home to find the children suffering. And of course, he was considered the key suspect right from the start. The police were determined to convict him, and he wasn't really in any position to either hire good legal representation or defend himself intellectually. At the end of the day, he was convicted. He's a black man. He was convicted by an all-white jury The judge was white. The prosecutor was borderline abusive to him. There was evidence of police misconduct after the fact. The nail in the coffin was that a jailhouse snitch said that Mr. Richardson had confessed to him in prison. And at the end of the day, took a very long time, but in 1970, an investigator, Mr. Mark Lane, picked up the case and started digging. But then it took years later for him to be able to prove that Mr. Richardson didn't commit the murders. The only way he was able to do that was that the babysitter on her deathbed in 1988, so 20 years after he'd been sent to death row, the babysitter confessed to killing the children. She had a thing for Mr. Richardson and wanted the kids and the wife out of the way, and this was her way of doing that.
Wow. What a case.
I know. It was just awful.
And where did this
where did it happen?
Yeah, where did it happen?
It happened in DeSoto County, Florida, not far from where I live. It was one of these situations where tiny town, didn't get a lot of national press at the time, only became an issue at the point when he became exonerated. Now, the other thing that just breaks my heart is he did file a lawsuit against DeSoto County and ultimately settled for $150,000. Now, shortly after that, it was the reason he was convinced to settle was because the prosecutors have immunity from lawsuits.
Right.
And so he was convinced at that time that this was the best they could do for him. Following that, in 2014, when Florida was reevaluating their compensation laws for wrongfully convicted people, he was awarded $1.2 million. And that was back in 2014. Here we are, 2020. And to the best of my knowledge, I looked it up again just yesterday. To the best of my knowledge, he has not yet received the money.
He has not yet received the money. Now, who filed for compensation for him? The lawyer that had represented him?
Correct. This was Mark Lane who ultimately filed for the compensation. Yes.
And there's no reason given why the money has not gotten to him as yet?
No. And again, I can't confirm that. It's just that from all the research that I've done, looking, high and low through the internet, everything I see says to date he's not yet received the money. That doesn't mean that he hasn't, but that's all I've been able to find is that there's no evidence that it's been paid. Now, Mr. Richardson now lives in Wichita, Kansas. He was a little bit lucky in a way throughout this entire ordeal. He was originally convicted and sent to death row in Florida. And then along the way, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional. So he was removed from death row. And they did reinstate that a few years following, but had they not declared the death penalty unconstitutional at that time, Mr. Richardson may well have been put to death. Right.
Yeah. That's right. And we talked about the possibility of your telling us a little bit more about your research into the death penalty. Do you want to tell us what you learned? I did some research of my own, but go ahead.
Oh, I'm not surprised, Harriet. I'm not surprised. Yes, in my second novel, which is Snook Wallow, I did decide. In the first novel, it is a fictionalized version. In Wrongful Conviction, there was a black man who was convicted of killing his two children with poison. From there, and there was a jailhouse snitch involved. But from there, the truth separates from fiction, and I didn't really put the victim on death row in that book. When I came to the second book, since I'd done an awful lot of research on death row, I thought, well, I'm going to have my second victim on death row. So I did write in Snoqualmie of a case where somebody was sent to death row in Florida. Like the shock that I had when I was looking into the Richardson case, I was completely floored by the death row situation in Florida. We're the second highest death row state. We now have 341 prisoners on death row. Florida is aggressive in executing. The only state that has more prisoners on death row is California. They have 737. But California has not executed anyone since 2006. So Florida brings them in. There is a great deal of time that passes on average before executions are held. In fact, the average is something close to 30 years. But still, Florida ranks very high, both in terms of the numbers of people on our death row and the numbers of people that we execute.
Right.
If you are on death row, first of all, there's no air conditioning. Cell sizes are 6 feet by 9 feet by 9.5 feet. Very, very small. There's no smoking allowed. They're allowed to shower every other day. They're counted every hour, so there is no uninterrupted sleep for these people. Mm. They're handcuffed every minute that they're outside of their cell. They are allowed 5 hours of fresh air per week, and they have a choice, if you will, between lethal injection or the electric chair in terms of the execution method. For entertainment, they have a 13-inch black and white TV in their cells, and they are allowed magazines and letters. They can correspond, but there's very little human interaction. It's, for all practical purposes, solitary confinement.
Right. Yeah. Terribly sad.
Yeah, I know. It's absolutely unbelievable. Now, nationwide, there have been 166 death row exonerations since 1973. 166 people could have been executed wrongfully, which has got to be the ultimate shock. You know, it just gives me chills thinking about it. The Supreme Court gets involved from time to time nationally. In 2002, they declared it was unconstitutional to execute mentally retarded people. In 2005, they ruled that it was unconstitutional to execute anyone under the age of 18. And then in 2016, they stepped in to affect the Florida sentencing rules. Now, again, I covered this in a fictional way, but when I found this out, I just couldn't believe it. In Florida, a person could be, prior to this 2016 Supreme Court decision, it was possible for a jury to come up with a simple majority vote with regard to sentencing somebody to death row. So 7 out of 12 people could send somebody to death row, even if 5 of people on the jury felt that was unjustified, unwarranted.
It didn't have to be unanimous, which
correct.
Was shocking.
It is shocking. So I did incorporate that in my second novel because at the time that was still the rule of the land. But since, I'm very, very pleased to say the Supreme Court has knocked that down. And at this point, there are people sitting on death row who were sent there in Florida, who were sent there with this simple majority rule, who are now a little bit up in the air as to what the disposition is going to be.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Yeah.
Wow. And the cost, you went deeper than I did, and this is really so informative. Everything you've just said, the cost is and I stuck to Florida as well because I thought that would be most interesting since we're both right here.
Right.
The cost is $51 million to enforce the death penalty. So people say, it's much better than life without parole, but really not, because of all of the appeals and the